As someone of Korean descent, are there any mixed feelings with you training Brian Ortega against the Korean zombie, like against a Korean fighter? Dr. Jason Park, thank you so much for joining me today. Today we are in a unique situation here. You're in the midst of training camp with Brian Ortega, and you're here with me, and we're gonna be doing a Q&A with Korean media and fans. Thank you so much, first of all, to come on and doing this. And how are you living in California right now?
2020 has been a crazy year for everyone, especially in the United States. Um, we've had to make a lot of adjustments, right? Because the states open and then some states are closing down. California still gyms are starting to open up right now, so we're always making adjustments. But that's the fight game. That's the professional sports game, is looking to adapt to the situation that's there and find out ways to still train and get our athletes at the best peak performance.
All right. Well, the fans in Korea, they might have known about you in the past, but there's new fans, that just heard about you. So could you give us some background information about yourself, where you're born, where you grew up, life growing up?
hmm Of course, of course. My name is Jason Park. I work as a doctor of physical therapy, a strength and conditioning coach, as well as a striking coach for different athletes from many different sports, including within MMA and Muay Thai and outside of MMA fight game. I'm born and raised here in Los Angeles. I'm of Korean descent, very proud Korean American, and it's an honor to be here to speak with the Korean media and share our perspective from LA.
All right. Now, before we get into Brian Ortega, a few questions about Anderson Silva. They want to know, how did you end up training and working with him?
Well, the path to working with Anderson was a sign of true passion. So I grew up here in Los Angeles. Um, I started watching Anderson actually when he was in Shuto. So way before Pride, way even before UFC, right? Like I've been watching him since I was about 15 or 16 years old. And it was by chance. I was watching K1 at the time. And, I think a lot of Korean Americans will relate to this because I grew up with my parents watching Korean dramas, right?
Hmm.
And back then, there was no internet. So you had to rely on video rental shops, later on DVD rental shops, to get those dramas in and so that we could watch them a few days later. Well, in the South Bay where I grew up, right, which is also where Black House is, which is also where Brian Ortega is from, was a strong Japanese community. There's a shopping center there called Mitsuwa. There also was a rental shop. And that's where I used to get my K1 and K1 Max DVDs the next day. And I was so engrossed, and I was like, what else is there that I can see that's like this? And they're like, well, there's this other event called Shuto, and they gave it to me. I purchased it. And when I went home, luckily enough, it was Anderson Silva in his first world title outside the United States fighting Hayato Sakurai. And what a fight to get to have your first look at a future legend, right? And from that fight, I just saw so many things that resonated with me. How intelligent of a fighter he was, how he adapted, and I just kept following him through his Pride career, and then also into his cage rage career into the UFC. So much so that I bet on Anderson Silva as a poor college student in his first two UFC fights and did very well in those bets. So he was someone who I followed along for a long time. And, my two personal heroes in sports was Kobe Bryant, being an LA native, and also Anderson Silva. They were equals in my eyes. And it was always a dream to work with them. So that is what led me to starting to gravitate towards Black House MMA, which I'm still very thankful to this very day that I have the opportunity to coach there. I began coaching professional fighters there in 2012, and had my first experience coaching, striking for MMA athletes into the UFC. And then just over time, I built my reputation, and one day I got a call from Anderson Silva saying, would you want to try out to work in the capacity as a Muay Thai coach? And of course, I moved things around to make that happen, and we had a very good energy together. And he said, do you want to go with me to Brazil to train for a fight camp? And I said, of course, what a dream. And it's led me to this wonderful moment.
Is it bittersweet to see Anderson Silva possibly retiring?
Of course, it reminds me of like watching the documentary that grew so largely this year called like The Last Dance, right? And knowing that at any moment in the past year to this year, that this could be the last dance for Anderson Silva. And, I think one of the big revelations I got from watching Kobe's last few years is that we as fans have to cherish these moments. Too often we get too emotionally involved. We get angry, we say nasty things to these athletes, but we have to know that they are human, one, and deserve respect, but two, our time of watching their genius is finite. And so it is very bittersweet. I'm getting chills now just talking about it, thinking that, is this going to be the last time we hear the ring announcer announce his name? To see him with anticipation, going to his traditional Spider-Man pose. It's hard for me to watch because I already watched it with my other hero, Kobe Bryant, recently. And, seeing his passing earlier this year, it definitely resonates strongly for me as an LA native and a fan of the two greats, Kobe Bryant and Anderson Silva.
Yeah, Anderson Silva, one of the greatest ever. There's no doubt about that. And I think he's a hero to so many people, not just fans, like you said, fighters. Like when they bring up guys, influential guys in this sport, in this short history, right, that we have, he is one of the guys that no doubt would influence, I think, beyond, right now, 20 years later, 30 years later, he's still going to be someone that people talk about. Now let's shift focuses to Brian Ortega's training camp. Could you break down your role, the role that you're playing in his preparations?
Yes, I am his striking coach, specifically in the art of Muay Thai, as well as his physical therapist.
All right. Well,
so
that's two
I
pivotal
play
roles.
two different roles. Yeah, two very important roles, and it's very interesting how that comes about in the camp with Korean Zombie. So I came onto his staff right before the bout agreement for Korean Zombie. The first fight occurred. So, I had no idea who the opponent might be. There were a number of opponents being named, but we started working during that time, about the end of the summer last year. And, obviously it becomes a lot more pivotal, and I thought it was very special to see someone like Brian, who grew up in the same area of Los Angeles as I did, looking to go up and fight internationally in Korea at that time, right, where my parents are from, and fight someone who is a legend in that country, in Korean Zombie, right? He's someone who we all respect, from WEC to the UFC. He deserves every bit of what he's earned in the UFC and WEC. So it was very, very interesting to be there at that moment. And then, this is kind of where my story shows it's blending together. It's like when Brian had to pull out of that fight with a torn ACL, I had to shift my role from striking immediately into triaging and managing with our athletic trainer and physical therapy staff, and then doing a lot of the work on my own with him to rehab that knee, work through the quarantine and get him prepared for this moment. So it's a lot of changing of the hats.
Definitely. Now, rumor has it that Ortega has changed his style completely due to him changing his coaching staff, some of his coaching staff. What can you reveal to us about that?
Well, I think just like I had spoken about Anderson Silva having a beginner's mindset, I think Bryan has been searching to find that kind of beginner mindset and find some freedom to just train with different voices. All respect to the team that brought him up, right? I have tremendous respect for them. And I think he's just looking for new aspects to the game that he could explore, and so he really took in this past year and a half a beginner's mindset to learn new martial arts, apply it into his game, and create new tactics to really enhance his strengths and bolster his weaknesses.
When I spoke with Bryan face to face, when he came to do the presser for the UFC Busan fight,
Yes.
yeah, he said that exactly. He said that that's what kind of hindered him, going into that last fight against Max Holloway. He wasn't able to be free, and learn. But since that fight, he's been able to do that. And I'm very interested to see what kind of style, what kind of tools that he comes with in this fight coming up.
Yeah. Well, there's this phrase, right, that's very commonly said in English, which is if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Right? And you see it happen in not just this instance, but all over sports, where sometimes we just are afraid to improve or change things because things are going so well. And that's something that's always the art. It's not just science, it's an art, to mix science and art together, where when you're looking at your athlete, how can you prepare them for not only the next fight, right, in the short term, but also what they're going to experience in the long term, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years later, right? And sometimes it just requires different voices being filtered in little by little. And again, with all respect to his team before, he just needed different voices to come in. And I think it's going to be something special.
All right. Now, the Korean Zombie, as of late, his last, couple fights since his return, he's shown a tremendous amount of confidence in his striking. What is your overall assessment of his development?
I really like the developments that Korean Zombie has made in the past few years, right? We know why he has that nickname, in the wars that he had in WEC and in the UFC. Even as something as we've seen recently in Yair Rodriguez. But he had great performances both back in the early Zombie days and also recently with how he's knocked out Hominick, how he's knocked out Bermudez, how he's been, and his last two fights with Moicano and Frankie Edgar. So I love the new style that Korean Zombie is bringing. It still keeps his tenacity, but he has his measured responses, and he is a UFC veteran at his caliber for a reason.
Just stepping outside of these questions, I wanted to ask you something from myself is, you're Korean American, his striking coach, his head coach, Eddie Cha, also Korean American. Yes. Zombie's Korean. Man, it's almost, this event is just kind of putting Koreans at the forefront in MMA. Don't you feel that way without people kind of shining too much light on it, which they should?
Well, I think it's beautiful that Korean Zombie has made a change to the United States. Obviously not for this fight camp. They exported everyone from Fight Ready out to Korea for this fight camp. But, I think it's great that he's gone over to the States to just get, just like Bryan, a new perspective, new voices, new ideas. Because at the end of the day, these athletes are special and unique in themselves. If you're a good coach, you can recognize people who have that special it factor And as a coach, it becomes less of being just a dogmatic instructor. It's to really be a teacher, right? And to almost allow them to tap into what makes them special, right? What allows them to perform at the highest level, which we all want to see. And I think it's just a natural occurrence, and I think it's really cool to see that Koreans are going. I mean, Korean Zombie has always been there. He's at the forefront and a pioneer. But I remember Eddie Cha when I was coming up and fighting as an amateur, how he had a gym in Westminster. And I remember seeing him back then. So it's very cool to see him come up. You know, I saw him when he was training Jared Cannonier last year when Anderson fought him. And, you know, I have a tremendous amount of respect for him. I'm very happy to see Koreans, you know, both Koreans and Korean Americans to be able to compete at this high level and be able to participate in martial arts.
Now, with the fight, how do you see the Korean Zombie versus Brian Ortega playing out?
You know, I think it's going to be very interesting, right? Because it's like a pressure cooker. Like things have been building up for a while. This fight should have happened last December. Unfortunately, Brian had a really bad injury at that time. And, you know, the athlete that he is he wanted to keep going. It was on the advice of his manager and his entire team, all the coaches, his rehab staff, right? That we looked at it together and was like, this is not in your best interest for the long term, right? And no one wants to see an athlete go out for a year, 2 years, especially when they're the top 5 because of an injury. It just stalls the whole division. So, you know, it's unfortunate at that time that we couldn't compete at that time. It's nice for us as fans to be able to come back in at this time, almost a year later, but with the emotions still there. And, you know, I think a big question for both fighters is how well they can keep their emotions intact, right? Both cultures, the Mexican American culture, Korean culture, they're very proud, warm to hot-blooded cultures. So I think that explains exactly, you know, the respect they had before their first fights. The press conference is very respectful, very loving, a lot of smiles, but also how emotions can get very heated afterward. And I think you're going to see that in the fight.
All right. Now, how is Brian looking from your perspective during this camp?
It has been amazing to watch him develop as an athlete. You know, he himself has talked about how, you know, again, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So the amount of changes that he's made in his diet and how he's taking control of his strength and conditioning, striking, just the organization of it. And, you know, a big part of this is in part with, you know, the combination of Mike Safai, myself, as well as Dr. Andy Galpin, who's an amazing resource as a sports science consultant, and allowing us to organize and kind of distribute the stress of training so that we can optimize Brian's, his potential and his performance. So you're going to see a leaner Brian Ortega. You're going to see him. He's developed so well athletically in his strength, his speed, and just in his skill set.
What is Ortega's personality like behind closed doors?
You know, it echoes a lot of things that we talked about earlier with Anderson Silva. I see him, he's incredibly humble and also very gentle. You know, I think what you see, because he doesn't go out into the media too often, right? So, because he's not one that requires that spotlight. And what you see in him is he's very charismatic, and he's a very giving individual. You know, he's always looking out for everyone, including his friends, family, teammates. You know, you often hear him say, like, he never wants to hurt any of his teammates or his in training, right? Which is very rare in the fight game. You know, most people look to hurt their opponents to give themselves that confidence. And for him, he's like the complete opposite. He has that confidence in him, and he doesn't need to, bolster his ego by knocking out his teammates. And I think that speaks to the character of Brian Ortega.
Korean fans, they have expressed that they cannot understand why Ortega slapped Jay Park. Do you feel like that was extremely out of character for Ortega?
I think so. I think on the professional stage, what was the impression of Brian Ortega before? Always smiling, always nice, very soft-spoken. Obviously people know that he had a hard upbringing, right? He came from a hard neighborhood. And just to put this into context, like I grew up in the same South Bay area of Los Angeles, and one thing you see in Los Angeles, like within a 3-mile drive, areas can change very dramatically, right? From upper middle class to very wealthy to, struggling working class, and, areas that have gangs and violence around. And so even though Brian and I grew up in the same area, we lived very different childhoods and upbringings. And I think that's one of the things that gets spun very big in the media. But, I think a big part of it came from the feeling of disrespect, right? And I think you heard this a lot in the first press conference, right? And even where Korean Zombie came with his translator to talk directly with Brian Ortega and say, I apologize for all the trash talking that was going on before. That's not coming from me. That's coming from new people on his team and his management. And it's not in his character. And I believe him, because Korean Zombie is very similar to Brian, that before all of this, I've never heard him say anything negative about any of his opponents. So, and I think this echoes full through where you see how Korean Zombie said, I don't want to do any trash talking anymore. It's not in my personality. I don't like the stress of all the things that come about from it. So what I would say to most people is, like, obviously we don't like violence. A slap can be very, very high on the violence scale or very low. I'm not one that advocates for any violence outside of the ring, right? But what Jay Park, whether it's through translation or from his ideas, it was very disrespectful for saying that Brian was ducking a fight when he actually had a torn ACL, not a simple injury. And also was very patient to wait for Korean Zombie respectfully when he had his eye surgery, right? So I think for Brian to see the disrespect that was given to him when he had to pull out for an injury, and he's waiting, and then you hear all this talk about how he's ducking Korean Zombie when we're in fact waiting for Korean Zombie to come back to fight him in March, and then after the surgery, okay, we're waiting for him to fight maybe in June, maybe in July, maybe in August, and here we are in October. So I think it just came at a very precise point where he felt very disrespected. He felt that it was unfair, and it came out in a non-optimal way.
As someone of Korean descent, are there any mixed feelings with you training Brian Ortega against the Korean Zombie, like against a Korean fighter?
At the end of the day, this is a professional sport, right? And it would be just like, like I grew up here in Los Angeles, so I'm an LA Lakers fan. So we have deep hostilities with the Boston Celtics, right? If anyone knows basketball. But if I was to work for the Boston Celtics as a physical therapist or a strength and conditioning coach, well, I would have mixed feelings. But at the end of the day, that is my job, to optimize the people I'm working with and who have entrusted me in their performance. And like I said at the beginning, working with Brian, like it was before we even had the Korean Zombie fight on the horizon. And so, you know, I look at like any other fighter. I have tremendous respect for Korean Zombie, no ill will. And I don't think Brian has any ill will to Korean Zombie either. I think it's just something that was very small and concocted that grew to be this big, big spectacle, right? And at the end of the day, we have to remind ourselves this is the fight game, right? We're always based around spectacle. But whether it's Conor McGregor and Khabib, right? Like things can grow out of proportion. But yeah, Korean Zombie is someone who I have a lot of respect for. You know, being someone of Korean descent, I looked up to him as someone who pushed the Korean MMA sport for a lot of athletes, opened a lot of doors. How amazing is it to see a nickname like Korean Zombie, to hear Korean come out on the UFC announcers broadcast. But it's just a matter of who we're training at this time, you know? And so I'm excited to have, and I'm excited to have this fight. And I know both of these fighters, I hope, will have good sportsmanship afterward and squash the beef and let it be in the past.
Are you going to head to Fight Island with Brian Ortega?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so you'll be there for the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, and you know, this I think is what I was kind of starting off by saying that, you know, Korean Zombie, when he moved to the United States, you know, it's by chance, and it's great that he's working with Eddie Chow, who's another Korean American, right? It's a Korean American, and on Fight Ready staff, you know, there's tons of, you know, Brazilians, Mexican Americans on their coaching staff in their fighter pool, and it's the same thing for Brian, right? He's a Mexican American. He has Korean Americans, Mexicans, Brazilian Americans on his staff. You know, and I think that's just a sign of the future. You know, it's not nationalism. It's the cultural milieu that we're in America.
All right, now the system of training in the U.S. You know, you talked about the Korean Zombie going to the U.S. and training at Fight Ready, which is a major camp out there. The system of training in the U.S. is much more advanced. You know, it's much more compartmentalized compared to how Korea does it. You know, the Korean Zombie does it a little bit different from everybody else. What aspect do you think Korean fighters should always implement in their training or their training camps from the U.S. style of training?
Well, I think it's the idea that you see in sports science, right, is the idea of your training pillars. So not just training with effort, but training for outcome, right? And that's where I think when we run on our emotions, obviously we're basing it on our effort, how hard we're working. So the only way that we can train better is train harder, do more. And I think that's where the science comes in, is knowing that sometimes you have to rest a little bit more. Take a longer rest break between rounds of weightlifting, or allowing the athlete to sleep a little bit more, or to eat at the right times. And some days having a little bit more carbohydrates or a little bit more protein based on what will make that athlete recover better, respecting sleep. And so this is where I put on a little bit of my sports science hat of looking at it like, what are our training pillars? We need to practice our different martial arts, right? Muay Thai, boxing, our grappling arts, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, judo. And then we also have to make time for our strength training, our conditioning training, and also what's coming out largely now is nutrition, recovery, and sleep quality. So I think that is a thing that I would love to see being brought over more to Korea. And I hope Korean Zombie opens up that door so that more of us professionals can go over there and consult and help push the Korean community up in the MMA world. Because at the end of the day, as someone of Korean descent and a Korean American, I would love to see more Korean athletes, both in the United States as well as in, actually, not just in, like, from Korea and the United States, but also all over the world. You know, one of the things that we work on is we're the sports medicine team for the USA national team for Muay Thai. So we often go to the World Games, and I've met tons of people from Korean descent, from the Ukraine, from Kazakhstan, from Sweden, from Germany. And it's cool to see it more, and it's confusing sometimes, like Kazakhstani, Korean Kazakhstanis, Korean Ukrainians, Korean Swedish fighters. And that resonates well with me, both as someone who went to Korea a lot when I was growing up, but also growing up as a Korean American and trying to identify how I can be Korean in this new environment.
There will be a lot of Korean fighters watching this interview. Would you open your doors to them if they actually did fly over to California and wanted to train with you?
Of course. Like, at the end of the day, we are here to improve the game as a whole. I look at this as like, one, we want to win fights and we want to have championships. But the legacy that someone like an Anderson Silva and a George St. Pierre created, right? They changed the landscape. Everyone changed how they approach striking, how they approach wrestling, how they approach the sports science side of things because of those two athletes, because they elevated the game. And we want to provide that same level of a change and create a legacy by improving the athletic performance of our athletes. So whether it's Muay Thai, but especially for our strength and conditioning, our sports performance, and sports science, we would love to open the doors for any Korean athletes, both who want to come to California or in this new age of internet and video calls. We have telehealth and video conferencing so we can consult with athletes abroad. And we do that already with lots of athletes in Europe, in Ukraine, and in Asia as well. So if any Korean athletes want to figure out a way to improve their performance, I'm completely open to them. They have an open door with me.
All right. Two more things. One thing is there's a big MMA UFC community, right? They subscribe to this major channel out here in Korea, and they wanted you to say, "I love you, Eungyo" in Korean. Eungyo is like the name of the group that they have.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I love you, Eungyo. Fighting.
No, but in Korean.
Oh, I'm not sure how to say that in. I only know 사랑해, so I don't know that's the right wording for it.
Yeah, that's right. Go ahead.
And it's Eungyo.
Eungyo, yeah.
Eungyo. 사랑해, Eungyo.
Do you have any?
Actually, can I say one thing to that? Is this shows why I love Bryan Ortega so much. Is that, again, I'm a Korean American, so I don't watch a lot of. I mainly watch Korean movies. I don't follow up with, Korean dramas and TV as much. So when Bryan was on the press conference and he was there in Korea, he learned something and taught it to me when he came out and he did this to Korean Zombie. I was like, what is this? Like, I wanted to do something special to show I respect the Korean culture and embrace the Korean fans, right? He knows he's going in there to fight someone who is a beloved hero. He wanted to go in with the right respect. It's like, what's a way that I can kind of diffuse the situation, the emotions? And he did this. And for me, when I watched that live, I was like, what does this mean? And he had to be the one to tell me. So that speaks to Bryan's character about how much he respects the Korean community. He respects the Korean culture. And, when all that stuff was heated up, I was kind of I was laughing with him. There's like, I don't think anyone there knows that my striking coach and my physical therapist is also Korean, and his name Jason Park.
Now, the last thing is, do you have some words for the Korean fans, the UFC fans, MMA fans? Just directly to them. Can you say something?
Yes. I believe that the Korean culture taught me so much about respect and strength of spirit and character. And I want them to open up to share that with the world. Be strong. be open, be the influence to the world that you can be. And that's something that I learned from being a Korean American, is that I want to see the same thing from Korea and have them share their love with the world.